40 years that bakery fed the whole town, and now she was throwing it all away with her own hands, whispering the one thing she couldn't stop thinking. Maybe I did this. By Tuesday, everyone had read it. Nobody said it to her face. They just stopped looking at her. And a woman who'd known these people her whole life couldn't walk down her own street anymore. She knew something. Nora could see it. But the second the question started, the girl just leaned against that van and closed her eyes. You don't know what you're asking me to do. Everyone else had gone home, but Nora couldn't let it go. And somewhere around midnight, staring at two pieces of paper, she finally saw the thing nobody was supposed to notice. 40 years she'd run that bakery. And it took one sheet of paper, handed to her by a man just doing his job, to end all of it. He'd stayed quiet for 5 days, watched a good woman take the blame for something she didn't do, and now, finally, he was about to open his mouth. But what he said next? Nora had worked at the cottage bakery all summer. 20 years old, home from college, just picking up shifts. And in 3 months, she'd never once seen it like this. Empty. Every shelf full, every light on, and not a single customer. Renata stood by the window, not saying anything. Nora didn't have to ask what was wrong. She could feel it. Something had happened over the weekend. Something that was about to change everything. Then Nora saw the messages. The whole town was talking. That big wedding on Saturday, the Harmon wedding, half the guests had gotten sick after. And everyone had already decided why. The bakery. Renata's bakery. There was a photo going around, a note somebody taped to the window. No proof, no questions, just a verdict. And Nora stood there on the sidewalk, reading it, thinking the same thing over and over. This isn't right. By that afternoon, it got official. A health inspector named Emmett showed up at the door. Nice enough man, soft-spoken, clearly didn't enjoy any of this. But the paperwork in his hand said it all. A formal complaint, an investigation. And if it didn't clear up fast, the cottage bakery would lose its license by the end of the week. Renata just stared at the paper. 40 years. Gone, maybe, over a single weekend. To understand what really happened, you have to go back. 3 days earlier, the morning of the wedding. Everything ran smooth. The order was big, and Renata counted every tray out loud the way she always did, one hand on each. 14, she said. Nora wrote it down. 14 trays. Their delivery driver, Sable, loaded them into the van and pulled out. Nothing felt off. Nothing at all. But keep that number in your head. 14. Now, over at the wedding venue, a different story was unfolding. The man running the catering was named Halvor. Good at his job, mostly. But that afternoon, he had a problem. More guests showed up than anyone planned for. Way more. And Halvor, standing there counting trays that were suddenly not enough, made a quick decision. The kind of decision you make in a panic. The kind you tell yourself is no big deal. He was wrong about that. The Monday after the wedding, the calls started. First one, then 5, then too many to count. Guests had gotten sick that night, and the bride's family was furious. Somebody, somewhere, pointed at the bakery. And once that got said out loud, it just stuck. Nora watched Renata's face as the messages kept coming in. She'd never seen her boss look scared before. Not like this. And the ovens were already going cold. By Wednesday, the orders weren't just slowing down, they were disappearing. The cafe downtown canceled their standing order. The diner, too. Even the church, 40 years a customer, went quiet. Renata sat there most of that afternoon just staring at her phone, watching a lifetime of work come apart one message at a time. And she still didn't understand how. She knew her kitchen. She knew her bread. None of this made any sense to her. There was one woman who kept showing up. Pilar, 63, lived 2 streets over, been buying bread there for years. She was one of the guests who got sick at that wedding, so her name was on the complaint. But here's the thing. She kept coming back to that window. Standing outside, looking in, never going in, like something was eating at her. Nora noticed. Nora noticed a lot of things people thought nobody saw. Emmett, the inspector, did his job by the book. Checked the kitchen top to bottom. Temperatures, storage, the logbook, all of it. And honestly, everything was spotless. Renata ran a clean shop, always had. But that only made it stranger, because the complaint was real. People really did get sick. So if the bakery was clean, then where did it come from? Emmett didn't have an answer. His paperwork just said the bakery was the source. Case closed, but Nora couldn't leave it alone. See, she was there that morning. She helped load that van, and something about the whole thing just didn't sit right. Everyone kept saying the bakery poisoned those people. Nora kept thinking, how? The bread was fine. The kitchen was clean. Emmett said so himself. So if it wasn't the bakery, then it happened somewhere between here and that wedding. And that's when she started really paying attention. So Nora went straight to the source, Emmett's office. She wanted to see the file, the actual complaint, the actual paperwork. And to his credit, Emmett didn't brush her off. He liked the kid, thought she had guts. But he also had rules. The bakery's listed as the source, he told her. That's what the report says. Nora asked him a simple question. How did they know? Was there a test? A sample? Anything that actually pointed at the bread? And Emmett got quiet. Because the truth was, no. There wasn't. Someone said the bakery early on. It went in the report, and everyone just ran with it. No proof. Just a name that stuck. Nora walked out of that office more sure than ever. Somebody was missing something, and she was going to find it. Then there was Pilar again. That same window. But this time, Renata looked up, and their eyes met. Just for a second. And Pilar froze, like she'd been caught doing something. Then she turned and walked off fast. Now, Nora saw all of this, and it stuck with her. Because why would a woman who filed a complaint keep coming back to stare through the window? Guilt looks a certain way. Nora had seen it before. This wasn't a woman who hated the bakery. This was a woman carrying something she didn't want to carry. So Nora made a decision. She talked to Pilar. Not corner her, not accuse her, just talk. Because Nora had a feeling that whatever Pilar knew, it was a thread. And if she pulled it gently enough, the whole thing might just come apart. Next stop, the wedding venue. Nora wanted to see where the food actually went. She found a staff member, someone who worked the event, and started asking about the delivery. When it came, who signed for it, all of that. And the woman checked her records and said something that stopped Nora cold. All 16 trays were signed in before 11. 16. Nora didn't say anything. She just stood there. Because 3 days ago she'd watched Renata count those trays herself. Heard her say it out loud. 14. She'd written it down on the clipboard with her own hand. 14 trays left the bakery. 16 trays showed up at the wedding. 2 extra. 2 trays that came from somewhere else. Nora's heart started pounding. She didn't have the whole picture yet, but she had a crack in it. But back at the bakery, Renata was falling apart. And who could blame her? 40 years, and the whole town had turned on her in less than a week. Nora found her in the back room, sitting alone in the dark, hadn't even turned the lights on. And what she said next broke Nora's heart. "Maybe it was me," Renata whispered. "Maybe I missed something. Maybe I'm just too old to run this place anymore. See? That's the cruel part about being blamed for something. Say it long enough, loud enough, and the person starts to believe it themselves." Renata started talking about her mother then. How her mother built this place with her own 2 hands, back when nobody thought a woman could run a business on this street. How she'd promised her, right before she passed, that she'd keep it going. And now here she was, ready to be the one who let it die. She pulled out an old photo she kept by the register, her mother, standing in the doorway the day they opened, flour on her apron, grinning like she owned the whole world. Renata couldn't even look at it. "What do I tell her," she said, "when I see her again? That I lost it over a rumor?" Nora didn't have a speech ready. She just knelt down next to her, took her hand, and made her a promise. "It wasn't you. I know it wasn't. And I'm going to prove it." She just had to get someone to tell the truth. Nora figured the delivery driver, Sable, had to know something. She was the one who drove that van. So Nora found her out back and just asked, straight up, "Did anything happen with that order?" And Sable's whole body went stiff. She wouldn't look at Nora, kept finding things to do with her hands. "I just drive the van," she said. "I don't know anything." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Nora could see it, the way Sable's jaw tightened, the way her eyes went somewhere else. She was scared. Scared of something or someone. And when Nora pushed just a little more, Sable finally turned and said the thing that told Nora she was close. "You don't know what you're asking me to do." Then she walked off. But Nora had heard enough. That night, Nora stayed after closing. She had a hunch, and she needed the paperwork to prove it. She dug through the delivery files until she found it. The bakery's own copy of the order from the wedding morning. And right there, in Renata's handwriting, 14 trays. Then she pulled the venue's receiving log, the one that staff member had shown her. 16 trays signed in. She laid them side by side on the counter. 14 out, 16 in. And she just stared at it. 2 trays. 2 trays that never touched Renata's kitchen. 2 trays that came from somewhere else entirely and got mixed in with the bakery's delivery. Whatever made those people sick, it wasn't the bread. It couldn't have been. It came in on those 2 extra trays. Nora sat back in her chair, heart hammering. She was right. She'd been right the whole time. The bakery never poisoned anybody. But knowing it and proving it, those are 2 very different things. Because a piece of paper only tells you what. It doesn't tell you who. Who brought those 2 trays? Who mixed them in? And most important, who knew and stayed quiet while Renata took the fall? Nora had the what. Now she needed the who. The next day, Nora went to see Pilar. Didn't ambush her, didn't accuse her, just knocked on her door and asked if they could talk. And Pilar, maybe because she'd been waiting for someone to ask, let her in. They sat in the garden, and Nora asked her gently, "You got sick that night, didn't you?" Pilar nodded. "I know what I ate," she said. But there was something in the way she said it. not certain, almost like she was trying to convince herself. So Nora pushed just a little. She asked what Pilar actually remembered, and slowly it came out. Pilar had been standing near the food most of the night. She saw the trays come in, and she remembered something odd. 2 of them came in late, separate from the rest, carried in by one of the catering people. Not the bakery driver, someone from the venue side. Pilar hadn't thought much of it at the time. Why would she? But now, sitting across from this girl who clearly cared, she started to realize what she might have seen. I never knew which tray the food came from, Pilar admitted. I just assumed it was the bakery. Everyone said so. And that right there was the whole problem in one sentence. Now Nora had a direction. 2 trays brought in late from the catering side, not the bakery. So she started digging into the catering company. And what she found was interesting. The company that ran the Harmon wedding was short-staffed that day. Understaffed, overbooked, and scrambling. The man in charge was named Halvor. Nora didn't know him, but she started asking around town about that wedding. And a picture came together. More guests showed up than the catering ordered for. Way more. Which meant Halvor was suddenly short on food in the middle of an event, with a furious family breathing down his neck. So what does a man do in that situation? He improvises. He finds food fast from wherever he can get it. And he makes up the difference. 2 extra trays. Nobody's supposed to notice. And if those trays came from somewhere that wasn't handled right, that wasn't kept cold, that sat too long in a hot van, that's how people get sick. Not from a bakery that did everything by the book. Nora leaned back and let it sink in. She was almost there. She had the what, she had the how, and now she had a name. Halvor. But a theory isn't proof. She needed someone who was actually there to say it out loud. Nora went back to Sable. And this time, she didn't ask about the van. She told her what she knew. The 2 extra trays, the catering, Halvor. And she watched Sable's face change, because Nora had guessed right. And Sable could see there was no point pretending anymore. Turns out, Sable had seen it happen. That morning, after she dropped off the bakery's 14 trays, she'd stuck around a few minutes. And she saw 2 more trays get carried in from a different van, stacked right in with the bakery's order. She even heard Halvor tell someone to just put them with the rest. At the time, it meant nothing to her. But when people started getting sick and everyone blamed the bakery, Sable knew. She knew it wasn't Renata. But here's why she stayed quiet. Sable did contract work for that same catering company. It was most of her income. She'd been saving up, trying to get her own delivery business off the ground, 1 van at a time. Halvor could end all of that with a single phone call. "You don't understand," she told Nora, her voice cracking. "I've got nothing to fall back on. No degree, no family money, nothing. This work is it. If I cross him, I'm done, and he knows it. That's why he does what he does. Because people like me can't afford to say no." And there it was. The reason a good person watched an innocent woman suffer. Not cruelty. Fear. The kind of fear that comes from having no cushion to land on. That evening, Nora sat Renata down and laid it all out. The 14 trays, the 16 at the venue, the 2 that came from the catering side, Pilar's memory, Sable's account. Piece by piece, she walked her through it. And for the first time in a week, Nora watched something come back into Renata's eyes. Hope. "So, it wasn't me?" Renata said quietly. not a question. More like she was testing the words, seeing if she was allowed to believe them. It was never you, Nora told her. You did everything right. Somebody else cut a corner and let you take the blame for it. Renata put her hand over her mouth. 40 years of pride, nearly wiped out by a lie. And now finally, a way back. But then the hard part settled in, because knowing the truth wasn't the same as clearing her name. The complaint was official. The town believed it. Emmett's report still said the bakery was the source. To fix this, someone had to go on the record. Pilar could describe what she saw. Sable could confirm it. But the one who really needed to speak was the one with the most to lose. Halvor. And he had no reason in the world to tell the truth. Let's be clear about what Nora was holding, because it all came down to two numbers, 14 and 16. On the bakery's order sheet in Renata's own hand, 14 trays. On the venue's log, signed and stamped, 16. 2 trays difference. It sounds so small, doesn't it? 2 trays. But those 2 trays were the entire case. They were the reason 40 guests got sick. The reason a whole town turned on an innocent woman. The reason Renata almost closed her doors for good. Everything hinged on those 2 numbers not matching. And here's the thing that made Nora's blood boil. Anybody could have caught this. Emmett could have. The catering company could have. All it took was laying 2 pieces of paper next to each other. But nobody looked, because it was easier to blame the bakery and move on. The bakery was the obvious answer, so nobody bothered checking if it was the right one. Nora made copies of everything. The order sheet, the venue log, her notes. She wasn't going to hand over originals to anybody. Then she made a plan. She wasn't going to expose Halvor. She'd learned something watching Sable and Pilar. People do the right thing faster when you give them the chance to do it themselves. So Nora walked into Halvor's kitchen. Just walked right in, this 20-year-old girl, and asked to speak with him. And you could tell, the second she said she was from the cottage bakery, he knew. His face did that thing a face does when a secret you've been carrying finally catches up to you. Nora didn't yell, didn't threaten. She just told him what she knew, calm and steady. The extra trays, the overbooking, the food that came in late and wasn't kept right. She watched him the whole time, and she could see he wanted to argue. But there was nothing to argue with. She had it all. And then Halvor tried the thing people always try. He said, "You can't prove any of that." And Nora just nodded, real slow, because she'd expected that. "Maybe not every piece," she said. "But I can prove 14 trays left that bakery and 16 showed up at your wedding. I can prove 2 came from your side. And once people start asking why, it's not going to matter what I can prove. It's going to matter what they believe." Halvor went pale, because she was right, and he knew it. The story was already turning. Then Nora did something Halvor didn't expect. She set a folded piece of paper down on his counter, a copy of everything. And instead of threatening him with it, she gave him a choice. "I can take this to Emmett," she said, "or you can take it to Renata." That was it. She didn't stay to argue, didn't wait for an answer. She just let those words sit there and walked out. And think about how smart that was. If Nora had gone straight to the inspector, Halvor would have fought it. Lawyers, denials, dragging it out for months. And all that time, Renata's bakery stays closed, her name stays ruined. But this way, Nora handed Halvor a chance to be the man who came forward instead of the man who got caught. Same truth. Two very different endings. And now it was on him. All that day, Halvor sat with that paper, picked it up, put it down. Because coming clean meant admitting he cut a corner that made 40 people sick. It meant maybe losing his business. But staying quiet meant letting an innocent woman pay for what he did. And he'd have to live with that every single day. The question was which one he could actually live with. While Halvor wrestled with his conscience, Nora kept building her case, just in case he chose wrong. She convinced Pilar to go on the record. And this was a big deal for Pilar, because it meant admitting she'd helped point the finger without really knowing. She sat down across from Emmett and told him the truth. I got sick that night, yes. But I never actually knew which tray the food came from. I just assumed it was the bakery. Everyone did. Now, that might not sound like much, but it cracked the whole thing wide open. Because the entire complaint rested on people being certain it was the bakery. And here was one of the original complainants saying, "Actually, I was never certain at all." Emmett wrote it all down. And you could see it on his face, the slow realization that his own report might be built on sand. He was a fair man. He didn't like being wrong, but he liked being unjust even less. So he did what a good inspector does. He reopened the file. He started asking the questions nobody had asked the first time. And the very first one was the one Nora had been asking all along. Why did 14 trays become 16? Then came the moment that surprised Nora most. Sable found her. Came looking for her, actually. And she said she was ready to talk. Remember, this was the woman with the most to lose. Her livelihood depended on that catering company. One word from Halvor and her job's dried up. She'd stayed quiet for exactly that reason. But something had shifted. Watching Renata suffer, watching this college kid fight so hard for someone who wasn't even her family. It got to her. I keep thinking about how I'd feel, Sable told Nora. If it was me getting blamed and somebody knew the truth and just said nothing. So she made her choice. She told Emmett everything she saw that morning. The 2 trays from the other van. Halvor saying to mix them in with the rest. All of it on the record. And just like that, it wasn't one girl with a theory anymore. It was documentation, a witness who saw it happen, and a complainant who admitted she was never sure. The case against the bakery was falling apart. And Halvor was running out of room. The only question left was whether he'd fall with it, or finally do the right thing. A few days later, Emmett came back to the bakery. But this time, he wasn't holding a complaint. He spread everything out on the table, the bakery's order sheet, the venue log, Pilar's statement, Sable's account. And he walked Renata through what he'd found. The bakery sent 14 trays, every one of them clean, handled right, logged, and dated. 2 additional trays arrived from the catering side, late, and were mixed into the delivery. Those 2 trays, brought in outside the bakery's control, were the source. Emmett said it plainly. Renata, your kitchen didn't do this. The report was wrong. I was wrong. Now, that took something for a man to say. And Renata, who'd spent a week believing maybe she really had failed somehow, finally heard the words she needed. It wasn't you. But there was still one piece missing. Everything Emmett had was documentation and witnesses. Strong, yes. But the catering side hadn't admitted a thing. Halvor could still fight it, muddy the water, drag Renata's name through another month of doubt. Nora had given him the choice. take it to Emmett or take it to Renata, and nobody knew yet which way he'd go. Renata looked at all that paper on her table and asked the only question that mattered. Is this enough? Enough to make people believe me again? And Nora, honest as always, told her the truth. It's enough to clear you officially, but the town believing you, that's different. For that, we need the one person who hasn't spoken yet. They didn't have to wait long, because right then, the bell over the door rang. It was Halvor. Standing in the doorway of the bakery he'd nearly destroyed. He had a folded paper in his hand, Nora's copy, the one she'd left on his counter. And for a long moment, nobody said anything. Renata didn't know who he was, but Nora did, and she held her breath. Because this was it. The whole thing came down to what this man did in the next 30 seconds. Halvor looked at Renata, this woman he'd never met, whose life he'd turned upside down to save his own skin. And you could see the fight in him. The easy way out was right there. Say nothing. Walk away. Let the paperwork sort it out. But he didn't. He walked up to her, and in a voice that shook, he said the words. It was me. The food that made those people sick. It didn't come from your bakery. It came from mine. I was short that day. I panicked. I brought in trays I shouldn't have, and I let everyone blame you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Renata just stared at him. A week of pain, of doubt, of neighbors crossing the street. And here was the reason, standing in her shop, finally telling the truth. And this is the moment Nora would remember for a long time, because Renata could have screamed at him, could have thrown him out, cursed his name, told the whole town what kind of man he was. Nobody would have blamed her. You could see it flicker across her face, the anger rising up, fully earned. But then something else moved in behind it. She looked at this man, really looked at him, and she saw someone who was terrified. Someone who'd made one bad call in a panic and then been too scared to undo it, until the guilt finally got heavier than the fear. And Renata knew something about that. She'd spent all week almost letting a lie become her truth, too. So she took a long breath, and instead of tearing into him, she asked him just one thing. Are you going to tell them? Everyone? The way you just told me? And Halvor nodded. Yes. I already talked to Emmett. It's done. I'll stand in the middle of the square and say it, if that's what it takes. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised even Nora. Good. Then we're going to be all right, you and me both. And just like that, the weight she'd carried all week finally lifted off her shoulders. The truth moved through town almost as fast as the lie had. Emmett filed a corrected report, clearing the bakery completely and naming the real source. Halvor kept his word. He told the bride's family, the venue, anyone who'd listen. He owned it. And the people who'd been so quick to condemn Renata? Now they had to sit with what they'd done. The first to come was Pilar. She showed up at the bakery, and this time she didn't stand outside the window. She came in, and she apologized for assuming, for adding her voice to something she wasn't sure of. I should have known better, she said. I've bought your bread for 15 years. I should have trusted that. Renata forgave her. Of course she did, because Pilar hadn't lied. She'd just been swept up in the same rush to judgment that catches everyone. One by one, others came too. The cafe that canceled, the diner, even old Walter who'd crossed the street to avoid her. He came back sheepish and bought his sourdough and couldn't quite meet her eyes. Renata sold it to him with a smile, same as always. Because here's the thing about Renata. She didn't want revenge. She didn't need everyone groveling. She just wanted her name back, and her bakery, and her town. And slowly, morning by morning, she got all three. But none of it, not one bit, would have happened without a 20-year-old girl who refused to believe the easy answer, who looked at 2 pieces of paper when nobody else would. The morning the bakery reopened for real, Renata pulled Nora aside. The shop was busy again, the bell over the door ringing the way it used to, the shelves emptying by noon like nothing had ever happened. And Renata, who wasn't much for big speeches, tried to find the words. "You know," she said, "I was ready to close this place. I really was. I'd convinced myself I was too old, too tired, that maybe I deserved it somehow. And she wouldn't let me believe that." Nora just shrugged, a little embarrassed. She said she only did what anyone would do. But Renata shook her head. "No, that's the thing. Anyone could have. Nobody did, except you." She squeezed Nora's shoulder. "You didn't just save my bakery. You reminded a whole town to look before it judges. That's a rare thing in a person. Don't ever lose it." And Nora, who'd spent the whole summer just thinking she was earning a little spending money, realized she'd stumbled into something bigger. She'd learned that the easy answer and the true answer aren't always the same. That sometimes the whole world will agree on something, and the whole world will be wrong. And that all it takes to fix it is one person willing to ask a question everybody else skipped. 2 trays, 2 numbers that didn't match. Everybody looked right past them, but not Nora. She counted, and because she did, a 40-year-old bakery got to see its 41st year. A month later, you'd never know any of it happened. The cottage bakery was busier than ever. Turns out, a town feels pretty guilty when it wrongs one of its own, and guilt buys a lot of bread. The line went out the door most mornings. Renata hired 2 more people just to keep up. And Halvor, he didn't get off free, but he didn't get destroyed either. He paid what he owed, made his apologies, and slowly started rebuilding his own name the honest way. By being honest. Renata even sent business his way once, when a customer needed catering. Because that's the kind of person she is. She'd rather mend a thing than break it. Sable kept her jobs, all of them. Turned out Halvor respected her more for telling the truth than he ever would have for staying quiet. She got that little delivery business off the ground too, eventually. Renata was her first regular client. And Pilar became one of the bakery's most loyal regulars, first in line every Saturday, always with an apology still somewhere in her smile. As for Nora, she finished out her summer, went back to school, and never made a big deal about any of it. But Renata told the story to everyone who'd listen. The girl in the red hoodie who counted the trays, who looked when nobody else would. Now, I want you to think about that for a second, because it matters. Everybody in that town was certain. The inspector, the neighbors, the customers, all of them, absolutely sure the bakery was guilty. And they weren't bad people. They just did what people do. They heard an answer that made sense, and they stopped looking. It took one person, one 20-year-old girl with no authority, no badge, nothing but a stubborn refusal to accept the easy answer. To lay 2 pieces of paper side by side and see what everyone else had missed. 14 and 16. So the next time everyone around you is certain about something, absolutely certain, remember this little bakery. Remember that sometimes the answer everybody agrees on is just the answer nobody bothered to check. And remember that it only takes one person willing to look closer to set the whole thing right. Thanks for watching. If this story stayed with you, stay a while. There are more waiting.